what we have with both the Church Committee and the House Select Committee assassinations is these are government investigators on a government payroll who have good criminal investigative experience. They looked at the way the Warren Commission went about its investigation, and it is they who wrote scathingly and damningly about the Warren Commission. Now, when the government admits to you that a prior government investigation was flawed, seriously flawed, that you shouldn't trust it, take the government's word for it.
Yes.
It's an admission against the government's interest by the government itself.
Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess Cannell, and if you're new, then welcome. I would love to earn your subscription today. Well, I'm in the middle of about a billion things. I've just gone for a walk, so I'm a little less formal than normal. I've actually got, look at these cool paper chains that I made out of an old hymnal. This is my homemade Christmas decoration that I'm doing for this year. So anyway, there's a little peek and a window into my life. I've also redone my bookshelf with my Mary Mormon signature and various JFK books, filling it up. So just excited about that. But I'm really excited about the interview that I'm bringing you today. And I just wanted to give you a quick introduction to it. So who we are talking with is Dr. Gary Aguilar. And I'm just going to read some of his bio off of Spartacus Educational. It says he's an ophthalmologist specializing in plastic and reconstructive surgery. He's an assistant clinical professor of ophthalmology at Stanford and University of California. He's lectured extensively on the assassination of JFK. He has a special interest in the medical evidence because he is one of only a handful of non-government physicians ever allowed by the Kennedy family privileged access to JFK's still restricted medical and autopsy evidence that's housed at the National Archives. He has written articles like How 5 Investigations into JFK's Medical Autopsy Evidence Got It Wrong. We referenced that in our discussion. He also wrote about Max Holland's work about the Warren Commission. He wrote an article with Josiah Thompson about the magic bullet and others. So he has contributed a lot to the lectures and the written works about the JFK assassination. And I got to sit down with him recently during the JFK Lancer conference that happened in November of 2025. So one thing I will tell you about this interview is that I was working out the kinks with my lavalier mics that a viewer generously donated. And so my first 2 interviews that I conducted during the seminar were not with the lav mics. I couldn't figure out how to get them to work. For all of the rest of them, they work. So you have that to look forward to. But for this interview, I'm asking for your patience. We sat in a lobby, and for the first portion of our conversation, you get some general background noise, but it's pretty clear. In the final portion of the conversation, the wedding that was happening upstairs had I think a karaoke time or something. And so you can hear some of the music in the background way more prominently. So we kind of moved the camera in more and tried to raise our voices. So I think you can still hear everything just fine, but I am asking for your patience with that because that was just one of the quirks of this particular conversation. All the rest of my interviews that are coming, the lav mics totally worked. And so that's something that will be a benefit of the next 3 interviews that I bring to you. But this is one that we pushed through, and I hope you still find it of incredible value. I really learned a lot from Dr. Aguilar. And the thing that we talk about in this interview that's the most important is just his understanding of the problems of the various government studies of the JFK assassination and the way that the American public hasn't really gotten the message from those investigations, especially the latter ones, which kind of upended the Warren Commission and said that they didn't do an adequate job. And yet the American public is still under the impression that the Warren Commission is in full good standing, which our own government has said that it's not. So that's one of the primary things that we talk about in this interview, but he walks through a lot of other things as well as the medical and autopsy evidence. I think you're really going to enjoy it. I can't wait to read your comments after you've had a chance to see it. Today we have Dr. Gary Aguilar, a longtime JFK researcher with us, and he is actually an expert on many things. I want to say, first of all, I read your article about medical evidence, and one of the things that I've loved was the idea that, and this really stuck out to me, and it's something that's guided me through our walkthrough. I've mentioned it to you guys, that if the Warren Commission was an honest commission, and they were looking at all the evidence, and sometimes they got it wrong in this direction, and sometimes they got it wrong in that direction, then you could just say, well, they were just sloppy, or it was just accidental mistakes. But when all of the mistakes always bend in the direction of against conspiracy, then there's an agenda. And that's a really helpful idea to just consider which direction do the mistakes go in? Is it haphazard and they're just a sloppy committee, or was there an aim? And so I just want to thank you for that thought, because it was really helpful for me.
I'd be happy to amplify on that a little bit, because the essay, it's a 5-part essay called Five Investigations to JFK's Medical and Autopsy Evidence Got It Wrong. And what I found in looking at these various investigations that looked into the medical and autopsy evidence, because I'm a physician, one of the few physicians outside the government in private practice who's been allowed to see the still restricted autopsy photographs, and they're still restricted autopsy photographs and x-rays at the National Archives. So I delved into this in the manner in which it was investigated. It was investigated initially by the Warren Commission, then later by another group called the Clark Panel in 1966, then later on by something called the Rockefeller Commission, then later on by the Church Committee and the House Select Committee. And what you found in all of them is error after error after error after error. Now, there was also an internal investigation by the FBI too. And again, as you said, error tends to be random. I'm sort of a medical physician. I've published in the peer review literature, and I've done peer review, and I know how complicated science can be. And errors happen, and they're inevitable in any kind of work, whether you're a historian, an archaeologist, a physician, a physicist. There are going to be mistakes occasionally. But typically, honest mistakes go, as you said, sometimes one way, sometimes the other. Error tends to be random. When you look at the medical investigations, both done by the Warren Commission, by the U.S. Justice Department, by the so-called Clark Panel, and by the Rockefeller Commission, so-called after Nelson Rockefeller, you find that consistently they're all making errors in ways that justifies the government's initial conclusion, Oswald acted alone. That's just not honest, and it's something that people need to understand, that there's always been a bias toward the government. Now, where this gets very interesting is that if you listen to the mainstream media, if you listen to the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, generally you will get a version of the Kennedy assassination deputy. Yes, the Warren Commission was imperfect. They had to hurry up and find the conclusions. But at the end of the day, we're talking about the Chief Justice of the United States, senators and congressmen from different parties. Nobody had an axe to grind. They ultimately found the truth. Sure, there are going to be some imperfections in that investigation, but the investigation was done with honesty and integrity. That's generally the view that's propounded by the mainstream media and by thoughtful, respected observers. But then, ironically, the Church Committee was established because of scandals. The Church Committee was what year? 1975. Now, the assassination was in 64. The Warren Report came out in October of 1964. And initially it was celebrated and believed by the majority of the population. Within a few years, doubts began coming up. And within about 4 or 5 years, a majority of people disbelieved the conclusions of the Warren Report that Oswald had done it and had done it alone. And so then the government went into some kind of an overdrive. There were other things that are get way too into detail to go into, but they then began trying to massage the public. The CIA secretly sent a paper around to all its assets in the media, because the CIA has been very deeply involved in our media, saying, look, if the question of the Kennedy assassination says nothing, it doesn't come up in a conversation, if the discussion doesn't come up in a public conversation, don't bring it up. But if it does come up and people express doubts about the Warren Commission's findings, just tell them. And this is the CIA advising their assets, in the public sphere, both in the media and other places. Just tell them, look, anybody that doesn't trust the Warren Commission, that doesn't understand the data, it basically has wild conspiracy theories that they're trying to defend. And basically they have been very active in trying to suppress any criticism of the Warren Commission's findings. But
which, the average American has to sit and ponder. We have to sit and ask ourselves, why would there be such an agenda? Why would there be a government agency having to work that hard to drive home a message for 62 years?
absolutely.
If the answer is Lee Oswald acted alone, he was a kook, he took a chance, he went up, he did this,
Not lucky.
got lucky,
Great.
no help,
Completely loner, not affiliated with anyone,
right,
under no anything.
then what is there to hide?
Well, it should be nothing to hide. Well, in the New York Times edition of the Warren Report, which was published simultaneously with the release of the Warren Report in October 1964, there are introductory essays. And one of them is by a well-respected New York Timesan named Anthony Lewis. And in his thing, which I have a copy of the original New York Times Warren Report, he says that the public, that the Warren Commission released all the documents and all the evidence accumulated in its investigation, excepting for the names of a few individuals in embassies and that sort of stuff to protect them, but otherwise it released all the evidence that it concluded. Well, that was complete rubbish. Complete nonsense. We didn't know it at the time, but over the subsequent 25 years, 30 years, the government began releasing documents that were originally collected that were not originally released when Anthony Lewis of the New York Times told us they had been. Somebody had told them that in the Warren Commission, telling them that, say this.
Yes.
And so all these documents kept being released slowly over all those years. Then in the late 1990s, the Assassination Records Review Board came along, and they reported quite publicly that at the time they went into business, there were at least still 3,000 documents from the Warren Commission case that had not been released. And then Philip Sheenan, a historian, wrote a book, and in contact with some of the Warren commissioners, he said that Howard Willans, one of the junior attorneys for the Warren Commission, he was then, and this is in the mid-2000s, that he was releasing documents that had never before seen the light. So the government, initially passed lies through to the Warren Commission, passed lies through to their toadies in the press, and the press disseminated that. You can trust us. We released all the evidence we have, whether they're agreed with our conclusions or not. And in fact, they'd hidden a lot. But this went along for a long time. And more people began becoming doubtful. Books like Mark Twain's Rush to Judgment and a number of other books very critical of the Warren Commission came along, and more doubts began surfacing.
Of those books, so you mentioned Rush to Judgment. If you were going to say, these are the top 2 or 3 that I would say there's an American who's trying to really get their sea legs under them in this case, where would you point there?
Probably at this point, Rush to Judgment is that he's a good writer and a very compelling writer. He does make a few mistakes for which he's continuously pilloried. The irony of this is the people that defend the Warren Commission will slam anyone that makes the slightest error criticizing them, and yet you read the Warren Commission documents and they're chock-a-block with error.
Yeah.
They never complain about that. I think Mark Twain's book is very readable, and it doesn't. The early books, Accessories After the Fact, would be a good one. Jim Douglas's book is an excellent one.
Yeah, JFK and the Unspeakable.
JFK and the Unspeakable is excellent. It gets a little bit dense for people. I think that there are other books early on, Accessories After the Fact by Sylvia Marr, who basically analyzes the Warren Commission's data on the Warren Commission's terms and finds that they're making lots of errors along the way. But to carry the story forward, more and more people are questioning it. Then there are a whole host of terrible scandals that were revealed in the mid-1970s. And so the Church Committee was established to look into these, and it had found that the United States had been involved in secret assassination attempts and killing people, and that also in the course of the Church Committee's investigation, they decided to examine the way the Warren Commission went about its work.
What did they find? Tell
Well,
us.
they found pretty much the same thing that the House selected a totally independent, now these are government employees, seasoned criminal investigators. And
Were any of them the same from the HSCA? Were any of them the same from the Warren Commission?
none of them were, they were independent of each other, Now, there may have been one or two overhang from the Church Committee, the House Select Committee, assassinations, but I don't think so.
Okay.
And none of them were involved in the Warren Commission.
Okay.
So these two groups of seasoned criminal investigators went and looked at it, and they reported back some things that should have been headline news in the mainstream media. The mainstream media doesn't talk about it. First of all, they found out that the Warren Commission didn't investigate Kennedy assassination. The Warren Commission, take my word for it, had no criminal investigators. There were no criminal investigators. What they relied on was the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover, arguably one of the most corrupt senior government officials in American history, announced on the afternoon of the assassination that Oswald had done it and done it alone. He was enormously corrupt. And by that, I mean, for people that won't know, because it's long been dead, here is a guy who, and you can find this if you Google around, you'll find it. He put 3 innocent men in jail on a murder rap to protect 3 mafiosos who he knew were guilty. And they were in jail for, I think, 20 to 30 years before they were finally exonerated when he found out that J. Edgar Hoover had done that. And he also knew how to control people. J. Edgar Hoover had this famous file cabinet of secrets he kept on people who he was trying to keep under his thumb. So when the Warren Commission was established, we later learned from the Church Committee findings that J. Edgar Hoover file-checked all the Warren commissioners, including the Chief Justice of the United States, and all the lawyers that were worked for him, and all the people who worked for him, for derogatory information. And we basically know what that means. He basically would blackmail people into doing his bidding because he had the dirt on them. He got the dirt on all the Warren commissioners, and then he went into the Warren Commission and under oath lied right to the Warren commissioners, and nobody in the Warren Commission said a peep. They knew he was lying, or they certainly had every reason to know he was lying. And the FBI then checked his testimony afterward, because that's what they would do. They would edit his testimony and make sure he didn't make any mistakes. And even they did not check his life. So he had complete imperious control over the Warren Commission's investigation. And in fact, what I like to say is people say, oh, Warren Commission defenders or foreign loyalists. What I basically say is that what these people are Hooverites. They're basically J. Edgar Hoover defenders. Because J. Edgar Hoover was the one that did investigating the assassination, decided at the outset who was guilty for it, and then basically steamrolled the investigation to make certain that was the conclusion they arrived at. And you don't need to take a Warren critic's word for this. These are seasonal criminal investigators, and there's a principle in law, and the principle in law is that if someone admits something against their own interest, you can probably trust that they're being truthful and that they're being accurate. So, for example, somebody, robs a bank, he drives away, they catch him in the car driving away with the bank's money, and he says, okay, I did it. Okay, good reason to believe he's right. What we have with both the Church Committee and the House Select Committee assassinations is these are government investigators on a government payroll who have good criminal investigative experience. They looked at the way the Warren Commission went about its investigation, and it is they who wrote scathingly and damningly about the Warren Commission. And basically, they said that the Warren Commission went awry because it basically was lied to, misled, and controlled and deceived by the FBI as well as the CIA and the Secret Service. Now, when the government admits to you that a prior government investigation was flawed, seriously flawed, that you shouldn't trust in, take the government's word for it.
Yeah.
It's an admission against the government's interest by the government itself.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's like a 30,000-foot view of what happened. I mean, I can go into details on all these things.
So help us understand why the average American today doesn't know that our own government critiqued and repudiated, or how would you say it?
Yeah, that's right. They were scathingly critical in their assessment. I'll be happy to send you some stuff I've written on that.
Yeah.
And my point in sending that to you is not to toot my own horn, but just so you have the documents. In other words, you can just click a link. It'll take you right to the source document where Church Committee says it, or the HSCA says it, or they get admissions from Warren commissioners. And through, why does that now? It is a privilege and an honor to be interviewed by you and by other podcasters, because for generations prior to this most recent 10 years or so, when podcasting didn't exist, the public had to rely on what was out there publicly. And there's an essay based on Church Committee documents, not invented by crackpot conspiracy theorists, an essay by Carl Bernstein, who was one of the two investigators for the Watergate burglary, won numerous awards for that. His name's Carl Bernstein, and he wrote an essay called The CIA and the Media, in which he points out that there were about 400 people who were actually CIA personnel who were embedded in the in our media. And we're not talking about peripheral, small journals. We're talking about New York Times, CBS, ABC, NBC, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, the big boys. Those are the guys who. So,
Can you name some of the characters that people may have heard of that have since been identified as part of that Project Mockingbird?
It's a Project Mockingbird. Joseph Alsop. These are names people won't have heard. Joseph Alsop apparently was apparently one of them. I mean, I read that article. It was published probably 35 years ago or something like that. I read it back then. And I think he did name names. I can't remember all who they are. But anybody,
So
just Google up. Just Google up the CIA and the media, Carl Bernstein. You can read it. It's a 25,000 word essay, and it was an expansion of declassified. This is the government's admitting this. Afterward, they were supposed to have done some changes and corrected all this. They never corrected it.
That was my next question. Now that it's been exposed, are we just done with Project Mockingbird?
No.
They cleaned their hands of
They
it?
haven't. This is Project Mockingbird. The thing I would say, though, is the stuff continued to be suppressed because what most people had access to was mainstream media. There were just 3 television stations. They basically told you various versions of the same thing. You had the mainstream media, the New York Times, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, major, Chicago Tribune, major news outlets that basically sang somewhat similar, surprisingly similar tunes. But now with podcasts, this is very disturbing to the masters of the mainstream media and to the government that has been able to control the message to the public. Because we're not asking you to take crackpot theories. We're pointing you in the directions of evidence and documents that is accessible to you, but never mentioned so you don't even know to look for it.
Yeah.
But we're saying, look here, look there, look there. Don't take our word for it. Take the government's word for it about bad stuff they've done.
Right.
I mean, I can remember when I was young, I grew up in a very right-wing family. My parents ran John Birch Society chapters out of our home. They were chapter leaders. I was a member of Young Republicans, Young Americans for Freedom. I campaigned, and I am old enough now that I was a up-and-comer and campaigned for the Goldwater for President campaign as a 15-year-old. Okay.
Wow.
And that's my
Heritage
political birthplace. It was the Republican Party. And I then, the scales fell from my eyes during the Vietnam era when I was in college. And I began wondering whether I had because I'd always thought we ought to be over there kicking commie butt in Vietnam. Boy, that's what America's here for, is to kick commie butt, And then I began reading a few things and reading more things. And then when the Pentagon Papers came out, the Pentagon Papers basically told us that everything we'd been told, from the Gulf of Tonkin incident to much of the stuff that was going on in Vietnam, they were lies. We've been lied to continuously throughout that war. And it changed my whole perspective.
Okay, so I need more information about that, because what year did that happen? I've heard about the Pentagon Papers. But
1973.
1973, the Pentagon Papers came out. Who released it?
There was a man named Daniel Ellsberg. He had been, I think, an officer and had been to Vietnam and had been a very high-level attaché and had seen what is now known as the Pentagon Papers. And what they were was an internal Pentagon examination of what was going on in Vietnam. And as he read through these papers, he realized that the Pentagon itself, its own documents, were proving to him, which we later learned when he released them, that the government had been lying to us all along about Vietnam. And so he was working in Santa Monica, California, for the RAND Corporation, where they had access to these. And there were, as the Nation magazine reported way back when, about 100 people that knew about these Pentagon Papers, yet he was the only person who took them out night after night after night, page after page, something like 7,000 pages, and copied them and copied them and copied them. And then he tried to take them around in newspapers, and they weren't interested. They didn't want to publish them for the obvious reason. Newspapers are basically in cahoots with the government, and they didn't want to publish them. But somehow he was able to finagle a competition thing between the Washington Post and the New York Times that, oh boy, if you don't publish these, those boys up, the New York Times is going to publish it. And then the New York Times was told, hey, listen, if you guys don't publish this, the Washington Post is going to publish it. And they said, damn, we can't allow ourselves to be scooped. So they finally saw the light of day, and then the flood came out. Well, it was in that era that my real understanding about how America works came to fuller fruition. Because I began to realize we can't trust the government. It's telling us the government lies to us. And so then when the Oliver Stone film came out about JFK, I heard a lot of debates where the people who were criticizing the government and who were against the Warren Commission were making a lot more sense because it fit consistent with what we were saying with how we lied to about so many things. And then I then began really investigating it. And as a physician, I got access after some very interesting adventures to see the original autopsy photographs at the National Archives, which were what you basically, principally what you see that is available online now, although at much higher quality, as you might imagine. And there is some information in some of that stuff that's not in the book.
So not the original autopsy photos.
Yeah, I saw the original autopsy photos.
What I mean is, not the ones that were released to us of the clean back of the head, or do they look like that?
Yeah, they look like that.
Okay.
That's I give an explanation for why the back of the head looks undamaged, even though lots of the department doctors and lots of the witnesses of the autopsy said there was a hole back there. And that's because the reason we don't see a hole in the back of the head is because the evidence is overwhelming, according to testimony by all the people who were involved in the autopsy, all three of the autopsy doctors, surgeons, autopsy pathologists, all the photographers who were there were two of them, as well as the people who developed the film. That autopsy photographs had then disappeared. They've vanished. They've been destroyed. God knows where they are. They no longer exist. But they were originally available once upon a time, and they were originally taken, and they've not vanished because those pictures would not, I contend, would not have supported the official version of the assassination. In many cases, there's a picture in the back of the head that shows no hole back there where all these doctors said there was one. But if you oriented the picture the way it was originally taken, with Kennedy lying on the side, you can see somebody holding his scalp over the back of the head. Well, that was one of the autopsy doctors. His name was J. Thornton Boswell. He was holding the scalp over that hole in the back of the head. And they took a picture just to show that there was a hole up there where a bullet went in. And I would agree that the bullet kept going up there. But that wasn't the bullet that killed him. The bullet that killed him, as you can see in this murder film, when he goes back to his left, came from the right front. That was the first shot. The second shot came from behind.
Yeah.
In any cases, the original autopsy evidence is of great interest to those of us that are involved in this subject.
Okay, so then let's talk about why don't people know about
the discrepancies between medical evidence, the discrepancies between the committees. What is it in our media system that has kept the truth from the American people?
I want to commend podcasters like you who are now getting information to the public that is valuable, honest, credible information that the mainstream media and the public media has not told us about. It's sort of a scandal. It really is. The public does not know a lot about this because the New York Times won't report it, the Washington Post won't report it, the Wall Street Journal, CBS, NBC, ABC won't report it. But now that there are podcasts out there, they're looking at original source documents and reporting what's there. And
Things that should have been reported.
they should have been headline news. Some of these things should have been headline news. One of the things which I may have mentioned is the fact that it was originally reported that all the doctors at the autopsy had refused it because the doctors in Dallas who first treated Kennedy when he was brought into Parkland Hospital said he had an extension in the back of his head, a big hole in the back of his head. And he went and had an autopsy at Bethesda, and the House Select Committee on Assassinations said, oh, well, all the people who were witnesses at the autopsy refuted the Dallas doctors, and they were in a much better position than Dallas doctors were because they were at an autopsy over hours. Dallas doctors were just trying to take care of Kennedy on an emergent basis for 20, 30 minutes.
Sure.
So let's believe the autopsy view. But they suppressed the documents. The government suppressed those interviews. There's no national security reason to do that, but they did. So those documents never saw the light of day until the Assassination Records Review Board released it in the late 1990s. And I was flipping through and I'm going, whoa, wait a minute. The government reported to us, the HSC, the people who had taken these interviews, that these witnesses had refuted the Dallas doctors. No, they didn't. They endorsed the Dallas. They said the wound was in the same place the Dallas doctors. So they lied about it. It caused a bit of a ruckus. I exposed that before a national conference attended by members of the House Select Committee on Assassination. Were all there, and they were all sitting there with egg on their faces. I said, "So why did you suppress these documents, and why did you suppress these interviews, and why, more importantly, didn't you show the doctors on your own committee, the forensic specialists, Dr. Weck, Dr. Michael Bogdan, all these doctors, none of these doctors were shown this information. You withheld it from them to spin a narrative. I mean, this is, well.
So ideally, if.
Now that should have been some kind of news.
Yeah.
And that the mainstream media, because it challenges our establishment, because it challenges the narrative that the New York Times has supported since the day the Warren report was released. Since it challenges that narrative, they've never wanted to embarrass themselves by saying, hey guys, I think we may have blown it. I mean, that's what an honest journalist ought to do and should do. It's not what American journalists tend to do, not establishment journalists, unfortunately. So podcasters like you can pull out original source documents and tell the public about them, because you're not going to hear it from the New York Times, you're not going to hear it from the Washington Post. Ignore the mainstream media on a lot of these stories, because they're not going to give you the real story.
It's crazy. It is.
It's very disappointing. But thank God for you podcasters. Now the question is, how long are podcasters going to have the freedom to do what they do?
That's right.
Because we're already seeing lots of censorship going on by Facebook, by Instagram, by TikTok now being taken over. Things that they don't want the public to know about. And pretty soon podcasters, and there have been a number of podcasters who've had, I think a guy named Klippenstein has had a bunch of his stuff taken down. A number of other people have had their stuff taken down. So we can only hope that you guys survive, because the public was continuously lied to by the establishment, by our establishment papers, and having an access to information outside establishment circles is so important in any kind of a country that calls itself a democracy.
It's troubling that the government from day one had an agenda. They did a committee that really there was no criminal investigators.
No criminal investigators.
A medical investigation, that's something I wanted to ask you about, because that's your point of expertise. If they were trying to have a robust excellent, rock solid investigation. From my layman's perspective, I think bring the Dallas doctors, bring the autopsists, bring all the photos, and make sure that it all matches. Make sure that everybody is giving the same picture. Instead, Dallas physicians, were they well interviewed?
First of all, the
Crime
yeah,
Commission?
no, some of them were not. And the statements of the Dallas physicians early on really do not support the idea that Oswald did it. Because they talk about a hole in the rear of the head. Well, how can Oswald have shot a bullet into the rear of the head and there be a hole in the rear of the head? And of course, the Warren Commission withheld the fact that Kennedy went back to his left.
Right.
In fact, they flipped a couple of the frames so that you would not see that in the Warren Commission volumes. They were very cagey about that. But
And of course, nobody saw Zapruder until Broden.
Groden saw it, yeah. You could actually see it, but you had to know how to get to it at the National Archives. But most people never saw it because you had to have a special ticket to go in and see it at the National Archives. But there's another way of understanding the autopsy, which I think is valuable just from, again, a high level. So the three men who did the autopsy, Commander Humes and Boswell, they were medical doctors who were essentially professors of pathology. They taught residents, that sort of thing. But they were what we call anatomic pathologists. They didn't do forensic pathologists. They didn't do gunshot wounds and that sort of stuff. They did people who died of liver cancer, and lung cancer, and heart attacks, that sort of stuff. They were anatomic pathologists. But and so they were brought in to do the autopsy at the naval autopsy, and the naval Bethesda was chosen as the place for the autopsy because Jackie said Kennedy had been a Navy man, and so let's do the autopsy there. So these guys that had no business doing an autopsy were brought in. They said, holy crap, we're really not qualified for this. Let's bring in somebody from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. So they called over there and they sent over a guy named Pierre Fink. Now, who was Pierre Fink? He did have credentials in forensic pathology, but he hadn't done a hands-on forensic pathology examination himself in about 3 or 4 years. He basically reviewed the work of other people. So he came in there as an Army guy into what many people call a Navy family reunion. And so he's in there, and at some point in time they're doing this, and Fink is over his head too. He's not what a wound like this called for. Cyril Weck, may he rest in peace, a close collaborator of mine on many projects. He said that an autopsy of that complexity would have required many more hours than they ever had to spend on it, and somebody who wasn't actively doing autopsies, particularly forensic type autopsy, had no business being in there. And Fink again was under the control of others because he was an Army guy in a Navy institution. And so at some point they wanted to set the back wound and to see where the bullet in the back went, and permission was denied. So Pierre Fink, a few years later, was down at the Garrison trial and being accused under oath. And they said, "Why didn't you dissect the back wound?" And there's a long transcript on this. It's interesting to listen to read. It's in one of the good critics' books, Jim DiEugenio's books. He quotes the whole thing, and he goes on for probably 15 minutes trying to dodge the question. Why didn't you do it? Well, because our object was to find out. Yeah, but why didn't you do it? Well, we had the cause of death. Well, why didn't you do it? Well, and on and on and on. Fink tried to dodge answering that question, and finally, the prosecuting attorney said, asked the judge, "Would you order the witness to answer the question? Why didn't you dissect the wound?" And so he said, "Well, because I was ordered not to." And he said, "Oh, you were ordered not to? By whom?" He said, "I don't remember. Was it a physician?" "No." But understand.
So it wasn't a forensic pathologist, and even he wasn't in charge of it.
And he was a forensic pathologist with no hands-on experience. I mean, look,
right.
I'm an eye surgeon, okay?
Right.
And I've been an eye surgeon a lot longer than I probably ought to be operating, but I continue getting great results. So I'm reluctant to quit what I do because it's great. It's great fun. It's very intense work and very exciting work, and I get good results. So I like doing it. But I told my wife this, if I would not take a month off at work, because if I'm out of the operating room for a month and I'm not there continuously doing eye surgery, at least once every week or every other week, and generally my surgical weeks are like anywhere from 10 to 12 surgeries a week. And so if I'm not doing that on a continuous basis, I have no business doing that. Don't let me in the operating room do that. Same thing with the forensic pathologist, and that's not just my view, and that's not just Cyril Rex's views. Morton Halpern, probably one of the deans of forensic pathology, and he was the coroner in New York in those days, said the same thing. He said, I think there's not the guy to do it, and they should have got someone in. And the other thing that's important about this is that they asked to have someone who was a practicing forensic pathologist come in. And within about an hour's travel time from the hospital in Bethesda, you could have had Morton Halpern from New York, you could have had Fisher from Baltimore, you could have had other forensic. There were a lot of people in the community who were going to come right in, and they were advised not to bring them in. So this is what happens. You took 3 non-qualified doctors, and they were told, and it's part of the autopsy report, that 3 shots were heard and Kennedy fell forward. And in the original handwritten part, it says fell forward before the limousine. So these 3 incompetent or insufficiently competent pathologists, they were otherwise in general pathology, they were fine, but not for this.
Right.
3 pathologists are given a body. The president of the United States told, look, he was shot from behind, here's the body, figure out how that happened. And of course, of course they're going to do that. Of course they're going to find evidence that proves the background information that they believe to be true. He was shot from behind and he fell forward when he was shot from behind. And so, and people that think that forensic pathology or anything in medicine is like, rocket science, that you can do that. It's not true. You rely on lots of ancillary evidence to make determinations about things. You rely on lots of supportive or detractive evidence that helps you arrive at conclusions about things. And conclusions are always tentative. Science is not, a lot of people that don't understand science is that scientific fact or science is merely a statement about what would be an observational procedure. And so, as with any kind of an autopsy, it's subject to revisions and reinterpretations, that sort of stuff. And now, on the basis of what we know, they did a horrible autopsy. It was done under military command. The military wanted the conclusion to be that a lone gunman had done it. They picked men who they knew were incompetent enough that they would basically give them the information that was with a scenario they were told about the circumstances of the assassination. They went with it.
Yeah. I mean, as I listen, I'm just thinking there's medical control, there's media control, there was control of the narratives about Lee Oswald and his military record.
Yeah, I mean, who knew that Lee Harvey Oswald had been a radar operator at a U-2 spy base where he knew about what our U-2 spy planes were doing going over Russia, and then he defects to Russia at the height of the Cold War, and he comes back, paid for by the United States, by the way, and he's not arrested after having committed an act of treason like that? Please, because he's working for him. Please.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I'm stupid. Okay, I'll admit I'm completely idiot, but even I don't think that makes any sense at all.
Right. Well, and none of us would want a country where a guy can do that, verbally go and say, I'm going to reveal state secrets, and just be allowed entry.
And just, we'll welcome back with an airplane ticket to return.
Yeah, here's some cash. We'll give you a loan.
Come on back. We'll take care. And then, of course, he takes his trip to Mexico City, 6 weeks before the assassination. Where'd the money for that come from?
Right.
This guy didn't have, as they say, a pot to piss in.
Yeah.
He was a poor guy making $1.25 an hour or something like that. And he had a wife and kids, this guy's also going to, pop off to Mexico City and stay in hotels and eat and that sort of stuff. None of this makes sense unless he's working for somebody.
And who is he working
and
for?
Who's he, and then that's the other thing. Everybody was slow nut, had no connections, on and on. Well, he must have been working for us. because all the guys he's hanging out with, both in New Orleans when he was there with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, where he was the only member, and of course all the people in Dallas, they're all connected. They're all connected with right-wing, anti-Castro, anti-communist, CIA-related elements.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely, from start to
So
finish.
none of this makes sense, but you're not going to hear respected, thoughtful, advanced degree, Harvard, Yale, Princeton journalists
No.
ever mention this. You know?
No.
And I've taught a lot of Harvard graduates and Yale graduates. That's just a professor at CSF, and they're good guys. They're good guys. This is not to demean the people who have strived hard and gotten into an Ivy and gotten a good degree from an Ivy, and then at a good place like where I teach at UCSF, or at Stanford. I've taught there too. But all these people know that there are certain masters they have to please, and journalists rise up to the ranks, and if they make a mistake and write the wrong thing, they just find their careers stall or they don't advance. So you have wonderful journalists like Robert Perry, who broke the Iran-Contra scandal. And there are hours I can tell you about, because I knew Bob Perry personally, about Bob Perry, who was never caught in a lie, broke an important scandal, the Iran-Contra scandal. And it was after that he was basically shunted aside and basically kicked out the door, and had a pretty good career after that, writing for independent media, by the way, Consortium News, which is still out there, run by Joe Loria, was something he established, and it's really a heads up. But also other journalists who, Pulitzer Prize winner like Chris Hedges. Chris Hedges won a Pulitzer Prize. He had a doctorate degree from Harvard. He was chief Middle East correspondent for New York Times for 7 years. He spoke Arabic, and in 2001, he came out against the Iraq War, and quite publicly. And he was brought in and chastised for that. He said, as a journalist, you cannot take a position on this. Now, it turns out that he was, of course, right to be against the Iraq War. It's number one. Number two, many of the other journalists in the New York Times publishing and writing and speaking supported the war. They were never chastised. They were never brought in for a lecture. They were never taken out to the woodshed. So there are certain issues that are permissible and certain issues not. So even if you're right, like Chris Hedges was, and he'd been in the Middle East, he spoke Arabic, he knew them better than any of the other journalists that were out there. He knew the area backwards and forwards and upside down. He knew this was a terrible idea for us to do this. And he went out there trying to warn the public, the New York Times, okay, and they basically eased him out. He knew he wasn't wanted there, and so this is what happens. You do have the credentials, Harvard degree, Harvard doctorate, credentials as an Arabic speaker, been in the region for 7 years, on and on and on. Pulitzer Prize. They don't care about how good you are, how smart you are, how honest you are, how factual you are. You've got to support the establishment. If you do that, your career will prosper. If you don't, how good are you at parking cars? Can you wash dishes? He'd make a good barista.
It seems like the pattern is, and you can tell me if you think this is fair, but it seems like the pattern is that there is an official position. It's the accepted position that journalists and the government are allowed to talk about and say. And then over time, little bits drip out that show that maybe that wasn't actually the best thing. And then at some point, they come out and say, everybody's known for a long time.
Oh, no, it's old news.
Yeah, old news, no worries
This is
about
the
it.
classic one. So I've done a lot of charity work in Latin America, where I go down and do on these missions, surgery trips, and operate on a lot of poor people. Bring sight to a lot of poor people. It's great work. Very, cost me a fortune in time and money, but it's so rewarding. I've done it maybe 15 or 16 times in my career. And so I got to know the history of Latin America, and because I know the United States was involved in the coups in Iran in 53, Guatemala in 54, and Chile in 73, as well as a number of other ones that I won't name now, like Indonesia, Brazil, many. Go ahead. I decided, I'm going to go look at the early reporting in the New York Times that was done after those coups occurred. So there was the San Francisco Public Library was right down the street from my office. I'd go down there at lunch and go through the microfiche of the New York Times and looked after the coup in 1953 when Mossadegh was removed and the Shah of Iran was put back in power, who then ran Iran with death squads and torture chambers, supported by the United States after they had supported the coup. Then in 54, when the United States supported a coup, we got rid of the President armbands in Guatemala and then set up a whole succession of tyrant dictators, completely anti-democratic. Arbenz had been democratic elected. They removed him. They put in a dictator like they did in Iran. And then in '73, when they removed Allende from the presidency in Chile and put in Pinochet, a murderous dictator. So I looked at the early reporting in the New York Times from all three of those dictators for the first, I think it was 2.5, 3 weeks after the assassinations. And in every case, you would find a report that says, reports the United States has something to do with this coup are completely misguided, anti-American disinformation and propaganda. We had nothing to do with this. That's what the public knows. So that's what the public reads. We wouldn't do that.
Of course we wouldn't.
Not America. America is the biggest supporter of democracy. We're the land of the free, the shining city on the hill. That's not us. We wouldn't do that. So of course, 25, 30 years later, the declassified documents come out and they say, oh yeah, that's all news. We always knew about that.
Yeah.
Oh, no, you didn't.
Yeah.
And the public didn't know about it either, because if they'd known about it at the time, maybe it would have made a difference. But that's what's happening now with the Kennedy case. It's been a drip, drip, drip of declassifications of every damn thing they told us about the case. Ends up being either a spin on the facts or an outright lie, but never wholly truthful.
Never the straight.
Never the straight story, And God bless podcasters like you, Jess, because otherwise this story won't get out. And we're not asking you to believe crackpot nonsense.
No.
We would like to direct you to the documents. Government, they say, let's just look at the government documents that you'll never hear about from our protectors, the media.
Yeah.
Let's just look at the declassified documents. Let's look at the stuff that the government has been hiding from you that's now slipping out slowly here and there and the other place. Just talk about those. Let's talk about the truth that is emerging and the truth of the fact that the U.S. government has been lying to you for all these years or withholding the truth.
Yeah.
And that's what the podcasters are doing now. And for as long as you guys are allowed to function without being censored the way many of them are now being censored on a number of different topics.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate you coming on the channel.
My
I'm
pleasure.
so grateful for your long, faithful, just steadfast work towards truth.
Just as a postscript here, the argument is often made that we're always we all warn critics. We're doing this for money, okay? So I have challenged anyone. I will say, look, I think I can probably establish the fact that I have to spend thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands of dollars on this subject, flying to conferences, giving lectures, writing stuff, thousands of hours on this sort of thing. If anyone can prove that I have ever made a penny on this, I will pay $1,000 or write you a check, and I can afford it. Trust me, I can afford it. I will write a check for $1,000 to anybody that can prove that I've made money on this subject. Because those of us that are seriously interested in this are not interested in this for the money. We're interested in this because we think that Jack Kennedy was directing this country in a different direction and away from war and toward peace. You can see it in his American University speech 3 months before he was assassinated. You can see it in the fact that he would not go in and pursue a big war at the Bay of Pigs. He backed off on a war. He pushed the nuclear test ban treaty, which infuriated the defense establishment. Operation Northwoods, I hope we talk about that at some point, where our military was spoiling for a fight with Castro in 1962 and wanted to commit a false flag attack on Americans, kill Americans, blaming it on Castro. It was a false flag justification for a war on Castro, and Kennedy said, oh, no, you're not doing that. He passed the nuclear test ban treaty. during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The military wanted to go bomb Cuba and invade the island. Kennedy set up a blockade, which worked, and he did not want to go in and start a war on that. And he was privately telling anybody that would listen. And of course, the mainstream media went nuts with Oliver Stone when he suggested in his film JFK that Kennedy would not have fought the Vietnam War. They just blistered him for that. Well, guess what, folks? Now, all of the really recognized historians agree, based on the classified documents, and what was even known then, when his film came out, even when it was known then that he was not going to prosecute that war, and he was telling people that privately. Get me reelected in '64, Kennedy said, and I'll get out of Vietnam by '65. Well, they were pissed off at the Bay of Pigs. They were pissed off about Operation Northwoods. They were really pissed off about the nuclear test ban treaty. They were really pissed they didn't go to war over the Cuban Missile Crisis. Damn it, they're going to have their war. Well, they just, excuse me, Mr. Kennedy, you're out. We got somebody in here who'll give us that war. And sure enough, 3 million dead later, and you know,
Lady Bird is richer.
Lady Bird's richer. 3 million people are dead. There's Agent Orange all over Southeast Asia. Many of our own veterans have suffered and died from that. Yay! The military-industrial complex is alive. Those are the people who we have to thank. So when Eisenhower warned the country about the military-industrial complex in his valedictory speech, it was actually, he meant to say military-industrial congressional complex, but he was speaking in Congress. He did not want to violate the separation of powers between the executive branch, which he had, and Congress. So he said military-industrial complex. But actually, what it really is the military-industrial conventional corporate complex. And now you basically see that people go into Congress, maybe worth $300,000 or $400,000, and they're in there for 5 or 10 years, come out with $10 million.
Yeah, millions.
You know, and they all more, much more.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. I sure appreciate you talking with us, and I know that the listeners are going to love this. So thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that talk with Dr. Gary Aguilar. I'd love to hear in the comments what stands out to you. What did he say that got your brain thinking or clarified something for you in an important way? I would love to hear about it in the comments. We'll hope to see you back here soon on this channel. I hope you have a great day. Bye.